also inaugurated an era of tax cut politics. And that is also something that I'm very interested in tracing out. I want to begin by addressing what most people think and what I thought when I started this research, which is that tax cuts are just something that is pushed by business groups. And so the first thing to take away is that that is not the case in the case of the Economic Recovery Tax Act. The ERTA was composed of two key pieces. One was called Kemp-Roth, after the politicians who came up with it, and the other was called ACRS, Accelerated Cost Recovery System. I won't right now go into the details of ACRS, but the key thing to remember is that Kemp-Roth was opposed by business groups and ACRS was supported by business groups. Again, I won't linger too long on some of this material. Basically, the material that I have is from primary and secondary sources around the time. This is the former head of the Business Roundtable who's saying that Kemp-Roth is political rhetoric. It's not really a serious proposal. We should just ignore it. Similarly, president of the National Association of Manufacturers. One of the things that I did for this book was I looked at a lot of historical records, archival material that had not been examined until this time. I actually had to submit Freedom of Information Act requests to get access to this material. And this is pretty much what it's showing, that the business groups were worried about this big tax cut, especially the Kemp-Roth piece of it. They were worried that it will decrease revenues, contribute to inflation. They worried that they need policies that would rebuild the infrastructure and capital base of the country. This is what 6 business associations said to Reagan. Again, I won't belabor the point here. Basically, this is the ACRS that business actually got. If you actually read the book, you know some of these quotes, so I'm going through them pretty quickly, but this is the basic point. If you look at the parts of the tax cut that business opposed, the individual income tax cuts, almost 2/3 of the ERTA is composed of that. If you look at the tax cut that business supported, the ACRS, the corporate tax cuts, that's really only about 1/5 of it. So I don't mean to say that business was completely irrelevant. Obviously, it was an important actor. They got a fairly significant tax cut for business, but there is still this puzzle about this big blue piece. Where did this come from? Where did the individual income tax cuts come from? And so that's what the book tries to show. And so to summarize it very quickly, and I will go through this in a little more detail, there are basically 4 steps. The tax cut is first brought to attention by a small band of people, the supply-siders. It commands widespread attention in the public arena in the US after the Proposition 13 tax cut in California in 1978. So these pieces of it, I think, are pretty well known. A third factor, and one that I think is underappreciated, is the role of Richard Worthlin. Worthlin was Reagan's pollster. So now, of course, we're used to campaigns having pollsters, but this was actually an innovation then. It was not the case that presidential candidates and presidential administrations had their own pollsters. And I will show you a little bit about what Worthlin did that promoted tax cuts. And then lastly, so once the tax cut was on the agenda, it had to actually get through Congress, and it did, even though Congress was controlled by Democrats at this time. This is Tip O'Neill, a famous Democrat Speaker of the House. So I will just show you very briefly these. So the origins of the policy, Jack Kemp, Arthur Laffer, Robert Mundell, and Jude Boniski bring this to attention. I kind of think of these folks as the wacky wing of established institutions. So they were all in some kind of established institutions. So Kemp was a congressman, Arthur Laffer was an economist, as was Robert Mundell. Jude Winniski was at the Wall Street Journal, but they were kind of far out there in these established institutions. So that's where the innovation was coming from. Getting it on the agenda, as I mentioned, because of Proposition 13, because of Richard Worthlin, it then wins in the decision-making arena because Reagan wins the election. And then afterwards, the deficit explodes and the tax cut is scaled back. So let me go through those a little more clearly. In a little more detail. So this is Jack Kemp. He was a former quarterback from New York who became a congressman. And he and his team basically came up with this idea. He said, ever larger government spending is the way the Democrats have brought the divergent interests of divergent groups of people together to be satisfied under one political umbrella. Then he says, let the Democrats be the party of deficit spending. We're the party of lower taxes. Let the Democrats be the party of quick fixes and more government jobs. We're the party of private enterprise jobs. Let the Democrats be the party of inflation. We're the party of a sound dollar. This should be the program of the Republican Party. It's positive, consistent with our philosophy, and economically sound. So he's basically saying that Democrats have figured out a structure of politics that basically works on a kind of patronage. Democratic politicians give their followers welfare and government jobs. And so he's saying that Republicans need to figure out an alternative political governance structure. And so he's saying that can be taxes. If Democrats are going to give people welfare, we will give people tax cuts. This comes to attention, especially because of Proposition 13 in California. This was a local effort to cut property taxes, which got widespread attention across the political sphere, as you see here in this sort of tongue-in-cheek Valentine. I have a guilty secret that fills me full of shame. Another bumper sticker has set my heart aflame. I'll keep his campaign buttons within my bedroom shrine, but Jack Kemp is replacing my former Valentine. So everybody is suddenly interested in Jack Kemp because of his having championed the tax cuts. Less noticed is Dick Worthlin, this guy. And he has actually, in the history of the tax cut, been equally important, I think. So he was Reagan's pollster, and he was taking polls about tax cuts before and after Reagan's victory. This is what he finds in 1978 during the primaries. So what he's doing here is he's taking polls that will ask voters, what do you think about a generic candidate who does X? So a generic candidate who limits taxes, or a generic candidate who favors strong defense, or things like that. And he finds limiting taxes is much more effective than either strong defense or a woman vice president. At the same time, being 70 years old is the weakest attribute of all. Indeed, only when coupled with limiting taxes does a 70-year-old with Republican economic beliefs achieve victory. Reagan at this point was 69. So obviously he's very interested in findings like this. How does a 70-year-old gain electoral popularity? Worthlin continues to make this case. Here it is in 1979, still in the primaries, when Republican candidates got on the tax limitation, tax initiative issues. When Republicans clearly get on those issues and express some social concern, invariably they can use that as a vehicle for election. This is, the primaries have started in 1980. He says George H.W. Bush was Reagan's main rival during the primaries. He says Bush leads Reagan among somewhat conservative voters. It would seem well advised to open up the ideological gap between ourselves and Bush. the governor should once again re-emphasize the tax cuts and the economic issues. That's Reagan, he's governor of California, or a prior governor of California. The data reflects our comparative issue strength over Bush in this area. So what he's saying is that in order to make a case for Reagan in the primary, we ought to emphasize the tax cut issue. Again, in Vermont, Republicans overwhelmingly agreed that a absolute tax ceiling should be placed in the federal government's revenue-raising powers. Fully 72% agreed with the idea of a tax ceiling. 61% expect strong agreement. And this goes on. During the general campaign, he says a candidate is elected president because he correctly identifies the central issues of his time. Over half the electorate now identifies inflation as the most important problem. Fully 56% of the voters say that Reagan, not Carter, offers the best hope to reduce inflation. Thus, the pocketbook issue cluster strongly reinforces our strengths and Carter's weaknesses. Others within the Republican Party also begin to notice the electoral potential of tax cuts. Just as Charlie Black, the political director of the RNC, who says to Jack Kemp, "You have indeed produced the issue on which this party can win some elections." I know that Bill Rock agrees with me that we must continually hammer home the Republican Party's support for permanent tax reductions. So again, I do believe that Camp Roth, reflecting as it does the common desire of people in both parties across virtually all taxes, all ideologies, is a magnificent opportunity area for the Republican Party, etc. Roth, the senator who's part of Camp Roth, says, "I think we have an issue today that's gluing the party together from California to Maine, from Florida to Washington. It's something that we can all get behind, work together on. All you have to do is go back to your constituency. You can go to blue-collar workers, you can go into businesses, go talk to housewives colleges. They're all enthusiastic about it." I've had candidates call me and say, not only are we for it, but when we talk about the Roth-Kemp bill, they stand up and applaud. Kemp says it touches a responsive chord in the hearts and minds of the young, the minorities, blue-collar workers, people who heretofore have not been in the Republican Party, etc. And here's Reagan saying, "The Democrats are handing us Republicans the best issue we've had in a long time, and it's one on which a majority of working Americans will agree with us. The issue is taxes." And saying, "No wonder Republicans are beginning to feel good about their party. We have an issue that unites us as a party and links us to the self-interest of the hard-pressed American taxpayer. That sounds like a winning platform for any Republican candidate come November." So in short, the book can basically be summarized as saying that the tax cut is a result of populists, not plutocrats. A lot of American politics on the left is about complaining about the power of the wealthy. But if you examine this one major instance of the origins of neoliberalism in the US, it was not really a plutocratic kind of policy. It was a populist policy. It was designed to win votes and to attract people to the Republican coalition who otherwise had not been part of it. So I want to, so those are steps 1, 2, 3, 4 of what I showed. I want to focus a little bit on step 5, what happens after the tax cut. So I showed you that the ERTA was the biggest tax cut in American history up until then and even since then. But look what happens immediately after this. There is this series of tax increases. So the 1982 tax increase, this was an interesting one where Reagan, in fact, clawed back a lot of what he had given to business. He clawed back a lot of the ACRS, but he did not touch Camp Roth. Over the next several years, every year, basically, there is a tax increase that is passed in order to address this deficit that the ERTA gets us into. And one of the points that I make in the book is that Reagan inaugurated the politics of tax cuts, not because the ERTA was a success, but precisely because it was a failure. It was a failure in that it produced a deficit, and then politicians learned that nothing happened. Voters didn't punish Reagan for the deficit, and moreover, markets didn't punish Reagan for the deficits because it became easier to finance deficits. So this failure of the ERTA to trigger economic growth. And the result of the ERTA in deficits is precisely what ends up, ironically, showing Republicans that deficits don't matter. So I want to think a little bit about this question of, was the tax cut democratic? Often we have this picture of neoliberalism as something that is pushed by the wealthy and that is not democratic. And what struck me in studying this sequence is that at this time, clearly the number one problem in voters' minds was inflation. Every poll, every survey found that voters wanted a solution to inflation. The problem for policymakers is that voters rejected all of the specific solutions to inflation that were being offered. So Jimmy Carter suggested that we wear sweaters and turn off the lights. That was not popular. Gerald Ford said it's just a psychological approach. It was a crazy idea, but it didn't really work either. Richard Nixon actually implemented wage and price controls. Hard to believe now. That didn't work. They didn't like monetary policy, which, ended up working, arguably, but was incredibly unpopular. And they did not want Reagan's tax cuts if they would lead to spending cuts. The tax cuts were popular, but people didn't want them if they led to spending cuts or to a deficit, as they did. So if you are a Democratic politician, you've got to respond to what voters want, but it turns out they don't actually want any of the specific responses. So I take from that a larger message about what we think of as democracy. So democracy can't mean simply responding to voters' preferences. This is a sort of reflection model. Voters want X as determined by surveys, and if the democracy gives them X, then it is a responsive democracy. That doesn't really seem to work here. Instead, I suggest a mandate model of democracy, that democracy means offering voters a choice, not necessarily their preferred options, but a choice, and then implementing that choice if elected. In that sense, of course, the tax cut was perfectly democratic. Reagan had been clear for a long time that this is what he was going to do. He did obfuscate a little during the election, but then he went on and made a democratic case for it. And then this leads to what I think of as the democracy's deficits problem. A successful democratic process, which was the political party mobilizing a grievance against inflation, led to undemocratic outcomes because voters do not want deficits and they do not want tax cuts if they lead to spending cuts or deficits. So that leads me to take a step back and ask, well, how did the US get into this position in the first place? And a second register of the book is to examine the political economy of the US that led to this situation. And here what I show is there is a striking divergence between the United States and other advanced industrial countries in household consumption as a share of GDP. And that this divergence, moreover, has not existed since time immemorial. It begins after the Second World War. The United States begins to be a more consumer-oriented economy. Other countries are more investment and export-oriented. One feature of that is that the US actually has higher income, profit, and capital gains taxes as a percent of total tax revenue. Other countries rely on things like sales taxes to a higher degree. And that allows us to give a structural explanation for the tax cuts. If you look only at four variables, GDP and the growth of GDP, inflation, and the tax burden as a percent of GDP, you actually get a pretty good prediction of what people are going to think about taxes. So this blue line, too high, this is Gallup and General Social Survey poll results of whether respondents think their taxes are too high. That's the blue line, the actual results. The red line is the prediction based on just these four variables. So as you'll see, what people think actually is in pretty good step with the objective factors here. So I conclude that the tax cut reflects pocketbook politics, as some scholars call it. It's an outgrowth of the American consumer economy in contrast with European investment and export orientation. I will just show you one of the odd consequences of the tax cut. So if you'll notice in 1980, this is the average federal tax rate on each quintile, and it's around here. We've had 4 decades of tax cuts by now, and Republicans have led this era of tax cutting. And the result is ironic. It's actually made the tax structure, the federal tax structure, more progressive, because what happens is that when Republicans get into office, they cut taxes on everyone. That's what George Bush did here, as you'll see. And then Democrats get into office and they raise taxes on the wealthy, as you see here under Barack Obama. So the result has been a steady decline in taxes for the bottom 4 quintiles, and a sort of back and forth for the top quintile, depending on who's in office. And then just to talk a little bit about the future of tax cuts and American politics and what we can tell about the US based on what I've done. I drew up 3 charts that I think explain the Republicans and explain in particular why they were so interested in tax cuts then, why they're so interested in xenophobia now. So chart 1 is about who was in control of Congress. Red is for Republicans, blue is for Democrats. For most of the 20th century, it was Democrats who were in control of Congress. They win the Senate partly based on these tax cut arguments, and then they double down on tax cuts and do much better. And this is showing the motivation for all of what I've showed. You know, Jack Kemp's excitement, the Proposition 13, all of the interest in finding an issue that can get us back into Congress. The Republicans have sort of been they've been out of control of Congress for 40 years. They're desperately trying to find a winning issue. The second chart says, looking ahead for the next few years, which political party do you think will do a better job of keeping the country prosperous? If you look at the 60s, there is just this enormous advantage that the Democrats have, 30 points at some points, in terms of what voters think which party will keep them more prosperous. They squander that. And squander is the wrong word because it's hard fought. The Republicans gain it in 1981, partly because of this issue. The Democrats now start to have an image of wasting money, whereas the Republicans gain this image of being willing to be austere, and the lead kind of. They trade the lead back and forth, but this huge advantage that Democrats had in the early period is no longer seen. And then lastly, if we come back to that chart that I just showed you about predicting tax dissatisfaction with objective factors, it also, I think, explains why the Republicans are turning to xenophobia now. And the basic story is that tax cuts were an issue that gave them electoral power. They went on to cut taxes, and because they cut taxes, tax dissatisfaction is now at historic lows. The tax cut issue just isn't having the magical electoral draw that it used to, which is why they have now had to turn onto this much darker path of trying to figure out appeals such as xenophobic appeals. All right, thank you so much, and I will stop sharing there.
Thank you very much, Professor Prasad. As I told you, it's an honor to have you here among us. Uh, I think that your book is, first of all, an important lesson of sociological methodology for every student from undergraduate or graduate studies. Because I don't know, but here in Brazil, it's not very common. It's quite rare to find sociological research that in some way denies its hypothesis. You tell in the beginning of the book, I was a young PhD student who, as everyone, was trying to grasp the way how business, corporations, special interests, even the Montpellier Society, and so on and so forth, led Reagan Economic Recovery Tax Act. And then you just got yourself inside the files and realized that it was not exactly like this. I have to confess that the first time I read an article from yourself, and the title was something like the popular basis of neoliberalism or the popular support to neoliberalism, I just stopped by wondering, but how come? It's anti-democracy, it's anti-populist. But I read your research and I was absolutely convinced because you had data, you had interpretation. And first of all, it's a lesson of methodology. And because of this, I will try to ask you some questions oriented to the present in order to enlighten our comprehension of the contemporary tax conflict. Uh, the first question, Professor, is to what extent should we lean on public opinion, surveys, collection of data on attitudes, behavior, opinions about taxes? Because on the one hand, your work shows that before Proposition 13, all the polls would suggest that people would support even balanced budget or a kind of social state, more spending in social rights and so on and so forth. But the Proposition 13 was a surprise to most of the public opinion data collectors. On the other hand, you present, and you talked about this in your presentation here, the data collections from the Reagan pollster, who detected that that was the issue. Now we win the election because we do not have, as Jack Kemp said, the spending popular measures of Democrats, but we have tax cut. And we will just abandon the idea of balanced budget because we'll win the elections with tax cuts, and we rely on public opinion data to follow this course of action. So my question is, to what extent can we lean on public opinion data? And I propose this question because, as we know, Vanessa Williamson, for example, published a quite interesting book in 2015, telling that, concluding that there in US, people are feeling proud to pay their taxes. People are feeling that they pay taxes not to get something in exchange for this, but because it's a moral, a civic, a Republican obligation, and things like that. Here in Brazil, we led the first tax morale survey in our country. And we found that people think it's a moral obligation again, that tax authorities should be enforced, they should have more powers. There in US, the proposals of AOC, for example, to increase the marginal rate of income taxes seems to have 59, sometimes 60% of popular approval. But if Biden, for example, or here in Brazil, Lula, for example, try to accomplish these ideas, will they really find popular support? How to deal with this public opinion data? This is my first question. The second question is about, sometimes I wonder if US would be a black swan when it comes to the bounds, the links between taxation and politics. And I say so because if we take, for example, Fernanda Valdez study trying to correlate in Global South progressivity, tax burden, and democracy. She found something like, first, progressivity and increasing in tax burden, and then more democracy, inverting the very Tyrian, Schumpeterian, Norbert Elias, Goldchild relation. So there would be a mutual determination between democracy and taxation, so that taxation fosters democracy. But it does not seem to be US history. Besides, we know that US has dollars, so they could finance a budget deficit with monetary policies that, of course, Global South could not adopt. So that's my second question. Would US be a black swan in this relation between taxation and democracy, or do you think that's not the case? And finally, about the present. We know that Trump would say in his first electoral campaign that he was proud to not be paying his taxes, that he would tax everything. Bolsonaro here in Brazil used to say, I evade everything I can, being it licit or not. And it, in some way, is as popular as xenophobia, conservative arguments. So do you think there is still some appeal in this argument, or is it really vanishing, and now the so-called neoconservatives, or what Melinda Cooper described as the encounter between neoliberalism and then social conservatism, are the best explanation to what is going on in US, Brazil, and other elections when this new right, outright, extreme right comes to the power? Well, sorry for taking too much time with my questions. And again, thank you very much for being with us this night.
Yeah, I would love to hear more questions as well. I'll be sure to answer everything, but I'd love to take more questions if there are any. Flavio has his hand.
Of course, Flavio. Yeah.
I think we can ask some blocks of questions. We ask it after the professor and ask your question, Frank. You know?
Sure, perfect. Yeah. If professor agrees.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
He suggested that we take some 3 or 4 questions and then you answer. If you agree, yeah, as you proposed, yeah, great.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So, Flavio, it's your turn.
I'm sorry. This is so. Good evening, everyone who is joining us. Good afternoon, Professor Monica. Actually, I think for you it is more appropriate to say good afternoon. I take this opportunity to thank you for being here, and I would like to welcome to our study group. By the way, Professor, one of your works in mandatory reading is our bibliography, the book you edited with Zach Martin in a J, the New Physical Sociology. So your book, you explored the relationship between the tax policy, inflation, fiscal disaffection, in the emergence of conservatism in the United States during 1970. I haven't seen a question, but I want to focus on 2 specific. Firstly, Your book, you're challenging the notion that neoliberalism is solely driven by business aiming to implement tax credit policies. It explores additional factors such as fiscal disaffection and what Americans do to increase tax on income, profit, and capital gains. The release and taxes influenced by inflation, namely income, property, and capital gain taxes. This led to tax collection difficulty in a core form reform. The book also highlights ideological division in the American electorate and the challenge faced by the political parties and present action plans that align with this division. Furthermore, the internalization of the capital play a role in the acceptance of tax cuts, as evidenced by the Reagan administration of financing the faith and fund foreign behavior. Can we consider the Republican movement primarily a successful campaign strategy that differentiated itself from democratic and subsequently mobilized and support for advocating a smaller state? What is the liberalism during the period a response to the coverage of tax structure, American inflation in the sentiment of the voters? The second question, a lesson highlight the book is the importance of learning for the European about the importance of progressive policies that promote economic growth without compromising social well-being. His book points that the European welfare state have successfully reducing poverty and inequality while support business growth. This suggests a potential comparison between progressive policies and economic development for the betterment of citizens. Whenever it is also emphasized the need to consider each country's specific economic and political circumstances, as well the role of the United States in the global economy. In light of these insights, how can we integrate this lesson into upcoming election shaping an agenda that promote economic progress and citizen well-being? Professor, I apologize for this latent question.
I was having a little, there's a little bit of static on the line, so sometimes I could hear and sometimes I couldn't hear. Is it possible to just quickly rephrase the two questions?
Repeat the questions.
Yeah, just the two questions, yeah.
Okay. I make you one question after I make other question, okay? The first question. Can we consider the Republican movement primarily a successful campaign strategy that differentiated itself from Democratic and subsequently mobilized and support for advocating a smaller states? Was the Belarus during the period of response of the converse of the tax structure, American inflation, in the sentiment of the voters? We can see that.
And I'm sorry, it's sometimes I can hear, sometimes I can't. I heard that you're basically saying, can we consider the Republican movement a successful campaign strategy? After that, I couldn't hear. Is it, Francisco, if you were able to hear, can you repeat what Flavio said?
Yeah, could you please repeat, Flavio, and then I'll say to Professor Monica Prasad.
Okay.
Sorry.
If you feel yourself more comfortable trying in Portuguese, you can say in Portuguese, and we
or is there a chat?
In reality, I can asking for you if the neoliberalism is in reality a movement of no is that a movement no that a kind of movement social, but reality we can say that the response of the Party Republican in the context of the end of 1917 is in reality a response for a structure for instance the context in the end of 1917. My question is that because most of scholars say that neoliberalism is a kind of movement social movement social produced for kind of action of businessmen. But in your book is no I can after the reading of your book, in your opinion, is not real. now reality, the rise of the liberalism and the political tax cutting is a response in the contents making to the Republican Party.
Yeah, I think I understand what
Are
you're
you
saying.
asking her if it's a matter of structure or agency?
I think I understand what you're saying. You're basically asking, is it a movement that emerges from the society or not? I agree with you that in so much of the scholarship on neoliberalism, the sense that we get is that this is somehow a movement that has emerged from the society, and specifically from capitalists, from the wealthy, and that's exactly the interpretation that I argue against. That in an ironic way, this movement, which was about cutting the size of the state, actually originates in the state. It's not exactly a picture of politicians dreaming it up and imposing it. They have to find what is going to be the electoral issue that sells. So there is a kind of society argument there. But basically, I argue that if you did not have politicians in this specific position needing to mobilize a particular issue, you would not have gotten neoliberalism. So in that sense, it's very state-centered. You know? Let me address some of Francisco's questions as well. So the first question, I think you said something about should we rely on public opinion? And so
how do we rely on public opinion?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I've tried to struggle with, and I don't really have a great answer to, is that public opinion is essentially contradictory. You know, if you ask people if they want a tax cut, they say yes, 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 a tax cut. If you ask people, well, do you want to cut spending? They say no, 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 no cut spending. If you ask, well, do you want a deficit? They say, of course not, no deficit. You know, so they want all good things, right? So what does that mean in terms of if you actually want a democratic country? And so that's why I was trying to you know, think through, well, what can democracy actually mean? If it doesn't literally mean responding to every single poll, you know, what can it mean? And so, you know, I do think that in that sense, the tax cut movement was democratic. You know, there was this problem. Inflation was producing a higher tax burden. Reagan presented this democratic solution, got elected, and implemented it. And then the problem starts, right? Which is that it has this result that people don't want. So, I mean, I think that you know, in retrospect, it's possible to think that there would have been a tax cut even if the Democrats had been in control, because there was just such anger at the way the taxes were going. But it would have been a much smaller tax cut. You know, and that could have been the way to do it, but it's not really possible to make, you know, a big dramatic electoral play based on a moderate tax cut. You know, so you have to say we're going to do the biggest tax cut ever. So, yeah. So I don't know if I have an answer to your question. Public opinion is definitely a reference, but it cannot be the sole guide for what we do.
No, yeah, that's exactly what I asked. And sometimes I wonder if, for example, that book from Sven Steinmeier, Taxation and Democracy, when he says that U.S. had a quite progressive tax structure, but it was a political problem because people faced it. Could see that taxation, and it was not enoughly popular in order to grasp resources to establish a real welfare social state. On the other hand, Sweden would opt for a regressive taxes on consumption, but they could grasp resources in order to establish a welfare state. Would it always be a kind of trade-off? I mean,
yeah,
when we have a deficit, people will ask for some kind of tax cut or something like this. But when we face prosperity and investments and things like that, people say, oh, okay, so now we could stop by and not pay too much there and pay more taxes and things like this. Would it be a kind of a cycle?
Yeah, no, I've thought about the question of progressive taxation a lot, and I spent a lot of time kind of wondering how the U.S. could be made to look more like Europe, but I don't really think it's possible, and I also am not sure if it's necessary, because the reason that Europeans turned to regressive taxation was because capitalism had been destroyed. There were no big wealthy capitalists to tax. Now, on the other hand, there is so much at the top of the of the wealth distribution that it kind of makes sense in a lot of different ways to argue for a more progressive sort of tax structure. I would love to hear from others of you. I apologize for this issue of the quality of the sound, but if you're able to, I'd love to hear what you think and what your projects are and what you're doing.
Well, guys, if you wish, so you can type in the chat.
Yeah, try typing. Yeah, that's Flavia, you had a second question as well?
Yes, Professor. Okay. In the book, you talking about the importance of learning for Olympians, about the importance of progressive policies that promote economic growth without compromise and social well-being. It is also points out the European welfare state have successfully reduced poverty, inequality, while supporting business growth. This suggested a potential cooperation between progressive policies and economic development for the betterment of citizens. In light of these insights, how can we integrate these lessons in the next election of the United States in shaping an agenda that promotes economic progress and citizen well-being? Is it possible to make that?
Yeah, this is exactly what I've been thinking about. This is actually what my next book is going to be about. So thank you for giving me the chance to talk about it, Flavio. I don't think we can do it in time for the next election, but basically, so after I wrote some of my books, I spent a lot of time thinking about whether it's possible to get a value-added tax in the U.S. to generate that kind of money. And like I was just saying, I don't really think it's possible. So then a question is, well, are there other things that we can learn from the European experience that we kind of bring? And there are. I think there are a few other things that we can learn. So one is Denmark has this very interesting active labor market policy. Probably you guys know about it a little bit. Basically, the idea here is that they make it very easy for employers to hire and fire people. So if you don't need an employee, you just fire them. That's fine. And then what they do is they provide intensive training to that fired employee and help them get another job. So it makes businesses very flexible, so businesses can hire and fire based on their needs. But it also helps to get people into the new jobs that are being opened up. So retraining and reskilling is a big piece of it. I think we can learn from childcare in Sweden, and especially parental leave policies, and especially paternity leave. In some ways, paternity leave is actually more important than maternity leave. Maternity leave is super important, of course, also. But if you only have maternity leave, then what you enshrine is this idea that men are workers and women are mothers. If, on the other hand, you have paternity leave, then you develop, as in Sweden, this idea that everyone works, everyone parents, There are some times when people are out of the labor force and raising children, but otherwise they're in the labor force. For this reason, Sweden has extraordinarily high rates of labor force participation. It's something like 10 percentage points higher than the US. So they do a really good job of just getting people back into work. And the third is Germany, which has this model of apprenticeships. Of course, it's very famous. So what they do is that if you're not going to go on to college, they figure out a way to get you a job in one of these big manufacturing enterprises. So you're already working there even while you're in high school. You're doing apprenticeships, so you sort of have this smooth path into manufacturing employment. So I want to note that what's interesting about all of these policies is that these are all policies about getting people working in one way or another. And so I think that that is another one of the secrets of the European welfare states that I think in the US or in Brazil or other countries we can learn from.
So in your next book, you stress this point that the accomplishments, the success of welfare social state is more a question of a labor market organization, and as you write in other works from yourself, is sometimes a question of liberalization of the economy and not a question of very intense redistributive measures.
Right, exactly. I mean, redistributive measures definitely have their place. Of course, we need pensions. Of course, we need, aid for the poor. But I think that's not the key lesson of Europe. I think there's more to learn. And then, Francisco, you asked this interesting question about Trump and Bolsonaro boasting about tax evasion, which is definitely interesting. I mean, I think it could go in a couple of different ways, right? It could be that they legitimize this idea of tax evasion, that it becomes just the thing that you do. Ironically, even though the US is supposed to be this anti-tax country, tax compliance is very high in the US. People pay their taxes. And so it could be that this idea of tax evasion kind of nibbles away at that. But I actually think that this is kind of fragile. I think that this argument that one should evade one's taxes, I think it's very easy to turn on that and say, well, you're so rich, you're not patriotic if you're evading your taxes. One of the things that has just been fascinating to watch is whether and how Republicans criticize Donald Trump. And so for years, they've kind of been, trembling and not criticizing him. But if you're following the campaign, the former governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, he has decided that his stance is going to be to criticize Donald Trump. So he has just been attacking him, and I think that some of these attacks could find purchase among the electorate. Donald Trump is a very rich man. There's no reason why he isn't paying his taxes. I think there could be a lot of frustration from people. I think one of the things that has been a common thread in the US is that people want rich people to pay taxes. So that's what I think. But Donald Trump has proved many people wrong before, so that could also be the case in this one. Yeah, I'd be curious what you think about the long-term legacies of Bolsonaro. Do you think he actually damaged the institutions?
Actually, I think so, and we have at this time some public policy, administrative law, political science research that indicates that unfortunately that is the case. 1 week after Bolsonaro taking office here in Brazil, he departed to the US, and he met a lot of post-Rothbardian activists, people from the paleo-libertarian movements. And he said a sentence that was quite remarkable and could predict what would be his government. He said, "I was not elected to build anything. I don't have different public policies. I don't have another way of managing the state. I will be there," because he was in US, "I will be there in Brazilian government just to destroy what happened since the military dictatorship transition to a constitutional state from now." And he accomplished that goal. It's not just a neoliberal government, a conservative government, an extreme conservative government, because the very bureaucratic structure of the state is now seriously hurt. So he was not trying, for example, to foster the agricultural sector and its exportations, even if it is not ecological, redistributively okay. No, even agricultural sector was damaged by his lack of bureaucratic measures, for example, to assure that they would get certifications to export their products. And the same happened with every single and small policy in Brazil. And now we have a fiscal problem. In his last year, he spent everything he could, and now the state is really broken. And we have even a bureaucratic problem. The public officers would retire and would not reposed. There would be no one to assume their functions, and now we have a decreased state. We had lost some bureaucratic procedures that were a common sense between left, right, and then it will take a long time to rebuild Brazilian state. But in my opinion, as in US, I think, as in Turkey with Erdogan, as in Hungary with Orbán, the major problem would be a cultural one. The extreme right is still quite organized, and they speak in the name of a lot of people, and they could come back to power winning elections, for example. It's not something that we can just say that will not happen in 3 years.
Mhm. It's fascinating to think about why it is now that we are suddenly seeing the popularity of destroyers. You know, I mean, it's in so many countries. It's in the US, it's in Britain.
But would you not think that it would follow the path described, for example, by Clausewitz in Europe, when he says that exactly because democracy cannot implement people's preferences, in some time there would come a kind of malaise, and this malaise would lead to a kind of instinctive, aim to just destroy the liberal constitutional state, because if it does not realize my interests in a Dawesian framework, so I don't want anything, I'll take care of my own business and let's explode the state. It is scary, but it makes some sense.
I mean, this is kind of, it's the big question that the world is trying to figure out. You know, this is what Xi Jinping in China, he thinks that democracy is a form that is not successful. You know, he thinks it creates disharmony in exactly this way. You know, and he's got a point. I mean, it does. Unfortunately,
yeah.
I mean, I think that I mean, who knows? Who can make prognostications at this point? But I mean, I think there is enough that is self-correcting in the system. You know, at least in the US, there is now this group of younger Republican politicians who are actually trying to come up with new policies that would respond to some of the difficulties that working class people have had over the last 30 years, and in Brazil, as I recall, everyone kind of closed ranks against Bolsonaro when he tried to say he had won the election, right? Like even his own party said, no, you didn't win the election. Kind of, they did a better job than American Republicans, I mean, from what I read.
Yeah, in some extent, that's what happened here. But it's interesting how you mentioned China, because if we remember the very epoch of Proposition 13, Economic Recovery Tax Act, it was a moment of the so-called third wave of democratization here in South America, Portugal, Spain, and so on. And in this moment, if we come to Adam Jaworski, even Samuel Huntington, Francis Fukuyama books, they all agreed that democracies performed economically and socially better than autocracies. And you mentioned China, and perhaps this is not the case nowadays. And if this is not the case, we are in a quite a tough time when we could whether have democracy, liberalism, fundamental rights, or economic development, investments, some kind of increasing in labor productivity, and we would not have the both good words at the same time. It's quite scary. Because,
political scientists always say that there are these examples of successful autocracies like Singapore, but if you examine all democracies versus all authoritarian countries, democracies do better. But remains to be seen whether that's still true.
Hopefully, it stays like this for so long. Lucas, you want to ask some questions?
Yes, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Monica. I'm delighted to hear you. Personally, it's actually such an honor. And you posed the question, why xenophobia is currently the agenda for Republican Party. Is it possible there is a growth in the welfareism and in the political imaginary in the U.S. Regarding like Obamacare and the growth of the critique of educational debts and I know, like, okay, here in Brazil, we have a lot of problems, but we have SUS, which is a universal system of health, and anyone could get health care for free. And it's not like actually the best system in the world, but it actually saves hundreds of lives. And we in the Federal University of Goiás, it's a public education and it's all for free, and we do have that. Is it possible that this growth in the welfareism and the political imaginary could be the source of this reason of the growth of xenophobia as the major source of votes for Republicans?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I didn't mean to say that the decline of the popularity of tax cuts is the only reason for all of this. But Obamacare is interesting because I would say that I don't know if it's Obamacare that is the problem for them or if it's Obama. So Obamacare is actually increasingly popular in the sense that people are increasingly, purchasing on these exchanges, and it's become increasingly difficult to roll back. So the Republicans have been trying, and they just can't get the votes for it because it would create a disaster, to roll it back. So Obamacare is looking stable, but I think you're right that the presence of Barack Obama was this irritant for a major segment of the American populace, and part of what we're seeing is coming out of that. And it does precede Obama as well. There was the Tea Party in the early 2000s, so there's always been this sort of unrest, but it's taking this kind of xenophobic form now, partly because of all these reasons. Obama himself, he has said that probably if he hadn't run, it would have taken another 20 years for an African American to be president, and so he thinks that his presence kind of push the question a little bit, so I think that might be a little bit of what we're seeing. I mean, directly as well as indirectly. Directly because Trump gets his political start by claiming that Obama is not a U.S. citizen, so that's where he gets his political start. So it very directly contributed to the rise of Trump. So yeah, so I think that's a good point to remember.
Thank you, Professor.
Well, if you allow me, Professor, I have one last question that regards on the prospects in a global perspective of what could be made of taxation, when you know that all the investments, all the money, of course, can switch the physical and national situation in an increasing speedy way, at least since the liberalization of processes from the 1990s to the present. But now we have some kind of political and even natural problems that are also extremely global. War and peace, besides all climate changes, and several conversations about global taxations and Vito Tanzi's propositions of an international tax administration, countering the tendency, the way how OECD is trying to rule the world from his model treaties, his rules for taxation that are just sent to Global South with no democratic discussion. Do you think it is possible to have energetic transition, pacification, peace, without a global inclusive tax regime? But at the same time, would a global tax regime, even one tax on, for example, aviation, but that would be administered by UN or something like this, would it be feasible? Well, that's the conundrum that sometimes I see. It's impossible to conceive peace and energetic transition without a global consultation that presupposes global fiscal and taxes policies, but fiscal and tax policies in a global dimension seem sometimes just politically unfeasible.
Yeah, that is such a fascinating question. I mean, I think that's ultimately where things have to go, right? A sort of global tax and welfare scheme. I mean, I think that there are two ways to get to it. One is global corporate taxation. And there are some steps in that direction. There was this scheme that's kind of that was recently begun to do that. And so I think that is something that one could have. The other thing that I was thinking is that it's possible to do it within Europe. So Europe could be a sort of model for doing it, elsewhere. The other thing I wanted to think about was carbon taxation, because you're pointing about issues about climate change, and I mean it's so the wisdom, the orthodox wisdom is that it's just impossible in the U.S. But I recently wrote a paper that points out that we actually have carbon taxes in the States. They're very, very small. They're very, you would have to raise them a lot to actually make them significant. But I mean, I think there's maybe more scope for this kind of thing than is generally thought. So,
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Does anyone else has some questions, comments? Flavio?
Professor, do you think after all this discussion tonight, I think I have one question to you. Do you think it's possible to say that without unfair taxation, aimed at social justice, could we say that the continuation of neoliberal politics can threaten democracy itself? How its constitution was the result of the electoral preferential?
Can neoliberalism threaten democracy itself? It's an interesting question. I mean, and if you extrapolate from my book, the answer would be that it's actually the absence of neoliberalism that is leading to this new kind of xenophobic, anti-democratic. It's the collapse of the electoral potential of tax cuts. That's the problem. So I never thought I would say this when I started, but it almost seems like when all we had to worry about was tax cuts, that was the good old days, and now we're actually worried about like people on the steps of Congress, I mean, so I think it's if it were possible to have a neoliberal opposition that could attract a following in a stable democratic context, I don't think that would be a threat to democracy itself. I think it's the danger is this party that has tied itself so closely to neoliberalism and then finds its legs cut out from under it. It finds that these neoliberal policies are no longer popular. So in the U.S., that's been a key danger.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else?
Well, thank you, gang. This has been a really interesting conversation and really fascinating to think about how you're going to translate these into the Brazilian context and kind of take it forward into the future and global taxation and things like that.
Yeah, that's our challenge. I don't know if we can accomplish this, but we will do our best. Professor, thank you very much once again. It was a great honor to have you here.
Yeah, and please stay in touch as you work on your projects.
Will do, certainly. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Perhaps evening now.
Professor. Bye-bye.